We're up to the next step in performing the get. Actually, we've talked about a lot of the text, much of the text, but now we actually talk about how you write it. We actually had a lot of this earlier. It says the Mishnah, Bechol Kotfim. You can write a get with any kind of ink. B'dio, B'sam, B'sikra, B'komos, B'kankantom. I don't really want to translate any of these things because I'm not really sure.
Is it the same that what we saw in Ketubot?
Yeah, so these are all the same words.
Yeah,
Rashi gives something here, not here, but elsewhere, and in the Gemara we'll talk more about it. He's here in the Rashi, talks about whatever. The Gemara is going to go through some of them, and Rashi gives words. None of them are terribly clear, and anyways, we'll see in the Gemara. So, anyways, the idea though is chol davar shekayama. The point is it has to be something that's permanent. But ein kotfin lo b'mashkin, you can't write it with liquid, lo b'mei perot or fruit juice, so as opposed to like water or fruit, lo b'chol davar she'eino mitkayim, or something which will not stick around, which will fade very quickly. Al hakol kotfim, now that's the ink, right? But you can, what's the parchment or what's the cloth? On anything, you can write on any kind of surface. Al ha'ala shel zayit, you can write it on an olive leaf, which I guess would have to be a pretty big leaf. Al keren shel para, remember we learned earlier about putting it on the horn of a cow. Remember that you can't have something, there has to be the ketiva and then the tina. You have to be able to give it to them right after, give it to her.
Right.
You have to write it.
So you have to detach it before you sign it so that you can give it.
No, but if you don't detach it, no tin la tapara, you can give your wife or the ex-wife the whole cow, right? So
yes, I forgot about that.
Your thing, right? But if you want to detach it, that would not be kosher.
It's not kosher if you detach it?
Correct, because it has to be the katav and natan. So you have to write it and give it right away. If there's anything in between the ketiva and the tina, then it's not kosher. So if you don't want to give her the whole cow and you write it on the horn and then you cut off the horn and give it to her, it would not be kosher. So if you want to use the cow, you got to give the cow the horn. Ayat shel eved, the same thing is true about an eved. You can write it on the hands of an eved. Again, it has to be with ink. That's kosher ink. But you can then have to give the eved as a gift and as a get. Otherwise, if you cut off the hand of the eved and give it to her, then that's probably a bad idea. But also, she would not be divorced. Notein la ta'eved. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer, ein kotvin lo davar sheish bo ruach chayim. No, you cannot write it on a person or an animal, right? Anything that's ruach chayim. Below al ha'ochlim, and you also cannot write it on food. And we'll see in the Gemara a little bit. Now, dio, this is Gemara. What is dio? It's diuta, which is not terribly helpful. Rashi does not have a word here, but some kind of dye, right? We usually translate
black
dye.
ink.
Sam is sama. Rashi here has a French word, or piment. I don't know what that means.
What is the word?
Or piment.
Piment. It's like pigment.
Okay, so some kind of pigment, I guess. So that's sam. Sikra, Amrava Baruchana, that's sikarta shma. That's something that we call sikarta. And Rashi here says it's red, right? Seva adom.
Yes.
Okay. Kumus is what we call koma, which is again another Rashi's the sap from a tree, strafa ilan, but I guess it's some dye. And kankantom, Amrava Baruchana, Mershmo, charta de ushkapi. That's the charta usually means the dark or the black color of ushkapi of ushkapi or the
shoemaker.
Yeah, cobblers. So and Rashi again has a French word, adrimant.
Not my kind of French, sorry.
Oh, not mine either. Okay. Now, says Gemara, obviously, when you have in the Mishnah a klal, anything that's permanent, latuye mai, latuye hadit. What wouldn't I have known? Latuye haditani debate Rabbi Chanina that if you're katvo b'mei tarya va'afza, if you write it with the water from tarya, I'm not exactly sure what tarya is, but afza are always the gallnuts, right? We translate as. So if you write it with the water that these things were soaked in, and therefore the water itself is dark, it's been stained by them, that would be kosher. So even though you're not actually using the thing, using the liquid, that's kosher. Tani Rabbi Chia katzvo ba'avar, if you write it with, usually translate avar as aver, right, as lead, shchor as coals, ubeshichor, which is some other kind of black color, it would be kosher. All those things would be kosher. Again, it's not so clear what the chiddush is, like why wouldn't these things be kosher? But Rashi, the shchor is pechamim, would be charcoal, But again, not sure. Anyways, they're all kosher, but again, not so clear what the chiddush is.
So if it doesn't make a difference, then why do we have to list all of them?
It's a good question. So, I mean, the point is we're listing all these things that are types of dio, essentially. They're
Okay.
all examples. You're saying, why do we need every single one?
Yeah, I mean, it's like it seems to be like, this is kosher, this is kosher, this is kosher. So why not go with this is not kosher instead of making the list of everything that is?
Well, the Mishnah also lists some things that are not kosher, but yeah, I don't know why why each one is a chiddush. But the point is that these extra things are chidushim because I guess they're not essentially. I don't know the difference, but they're not essentially dyes on their own. They're dyed water, or it's like a second level,
Okay.
but it is permanent. Itmar, now we, relevant issue besides writing again, of course, is writing on Shabbos, right? So Amavir Dio Gabi Sikra b'Shabbat, someone who passes ink over letters that are written already in Sikra. Now, again, it's not so clear what would be not such a problem with this, but Sikra, remember, Rashi said was the red dye. So something is already written, but you essentially trace it over, right? Or you put Dio, which is a black ink, on top of something that's already written with Sikra on Shabbat. Is that considered to be writing already, right? So according to, meaning writing on top of it, so Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish Tamri Tervayo chayav shtayim. You'd be chayav actually twice. Achat mishum kotev, one because you're writing these letters, meaning you're dyeing the shape of the letter. Achat mishum mochek, and one because you're erasing the previous outline of the letter, right? So because you're essentially putting black on top of red, you'd be chayav both for the writing, did a letter aleph, you'd be chayav for also erasing the previous letter. However, if it was dio agabi dio or sikra agabi sikra, if it was black on top of black or red on top of red, you would be patur because you're not adding anything, right? You're just reinforcing the letter, but it's already written. You're not erasing anything because you're not obscuring the previous color. And so you'd be patur on Shabbat. You're not supposed to do it, patur avol asur, but you'd be patur. And sikra agabi dio, but if you do the opposite, if you have black and you put red on top of it, so some say Amrila Chayav, Amrila Patur, some say it's Chayav, and some say it's Patur. As says Gemara, Amrila Chayav, some say you're Chayav for in fact being Mocheku, right? Because what you're doing is you're erasing the darker, the better color, which is the black. So you're interfering with the clarity of the writing, which is considered Mechika. And patur mikako, then that what you're doing is ruining it because it's written clearly in black and you're making it worse, right? Because I guess red is less distinct, right? So you're making it worse. And of course, anything you do on Shabbat that's mikalkel is patur, right? Now, again, it's patur avol asur, but it's patur. And so because you're being mikalkel, you are not chayav, at least in Doraita, on destroying on Shabbat, on erasing or on writing on Shabbat. If you recall, Masechet Shabbat, Mekalkel, erasing sounds like it's destructive by nature, but remember we talked about erasing as being there for the purpose of writing something new. Okay, Hanan, I got to find you the place here. Today's daf, I'll just give an introduction. I'm caught up.
I'm fine.
Yeah, okay, sorry, I didn't see when you joined. Anyway, so discussion about writing, right? It's all about who has to write and write on the get. So Reish Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan, and we had this before. Right? If you have witnesses on a get, you assign your witnesses, but they are illiterate. They don't know how to sign their names. So right? Can you write for them? We just mentioned basically that this was a way I think they would do it. Sikra was this red dye, which was not as distinct. It was permanent, but not as distinct as a black dye. So can you sort of give them hints in the red dye and they could sign on top of it? So basically you almost like a trace. So it's not exactly a trace, right? Because you write on the letters. Now, there's a lot of debates about what exactly you wrote. But let's just say you write the letter or you write the indication of their name and the letter of their name, and they put the black ink on top of it. So would you say that's katav or ain't katav? Is that considered writing or is it not writing? And Amar Lei, so Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, ain't katav. That's not considered writing. And so therefore they would not be kosher edim because they did not sign themselves on the get. Amar Lei, so Reish Lakish responded to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbeinu, what are you talking? You just taught us Katav Elyon, Katav Linyan Shabbat. right? That writing on top is considered to be writing in Shabbat. You'd be chayiv mita on Shabbat if you wrote in black on top of what was written in red, because black is more permanent. So you told me that for Shabbat, you're not allowed to do it. Amalei said, Rabbi Yochanan said back to Rish Lakish, because midamim literally means because we assume or because we tell you to behave in a certain way, does it mean we should do a ma'aseh? And so what Rashi sort of explains is that all I said on Shabbat is that you have to be machmir. You have to assume that it's writing, but I wouldn't rely on this as a kula for a get, right? So if the writing is on Shabbat, you're not allowed to do it, but on a get, you'd have to be assuming it's the chumrah because we don't know for sure. So I was telling you to be careful on Shabbat. I wasn't telling you that you can go out and rely on this for all purposes. Itmar. Continues the Gemara. What do you do? And this is, again, what do you do when the Edim, where am I? Itmar. Sorry, I got it. Here we go. Edim she'ein yodim lachtom. Let's say you have witnesses who don't know how to sign. So we just said you can't write the letter for them and have them write on top of it, according to Rabbi Yochanan. So what do? So Rav Amar mikarin lahem niyar chalak. What you do is you tear off a blank piece of niyar, of paper, right? Umimalin et akraim diya. And basically you tear off, you essentially make a stencil, right? So you take a piece of paper, you tear off or you rip out the outline of their name or their letters, and they fill it up with ink. So they use the stencil and they fill it up with ink so that they did it themselves. It's really complicated. Tosas here disagrees with what I just explained, because the challenge with some of this is that how do you then recognize their signature, right? Because if it's a stencil, then basically it's like block letter. And the whole point of a signature we've talked about is that you can recognize that's someone's signature. So there's other interpretations of exactly what you did here, but this is the simplest way to read it.
Why
So
would you have AD that don't know how to write? Is that the whole purpose? Is that they should sign it?
So you're saying, how do they know it's written there? We're going to ask that in a
Oh
little bit.
no, I mean, who's getting these people to be the AD?
This is who you have. Remember, they struggled, right? Not everyone was literate, or maybe many people were illiterate, and you had to write a get. So you had to have witnesses. They're reliable people. They're honest people. They're observe everything. They don't know how to write their names. So Rav says again, let you do that. You fill out a stencil basically. Ushmul amar ba'avar. You should do it. That basically so we understand this to mean avar is like lead, right? Avar. So you write their name out with avar, and then they write on top of it. Says, what are you talking about? Avar sankadaitach. You really think that's what it means? Vatani Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia said, which we actually quoted earlier in the Gemara, that ktavo ba'avar b'shchar b'shichor kasher. If you write with avar, shichar or shichor, which are other, black shichar, remember we said were the charcoals, shichor some other black paint, it's kasher. So if that writing is kosher, then if I write someone else's name, I write Hanan on it. I'm obviously not Hanan, I can't write it, and so you writing on top of it doesn't do anything. So if my writing counts, how could it be as a template for your writing? Says Gemara, lo kasha, you're right. It depends on whether you're using something permanent or not. Habba avra, habba maya da avra. When Rabbi Chia said you can write with lead, I guess, which is essentially a pencil, right? A little bit of lead. When Rabbi Chia said you can write with lead, he meant the lead itself, right? But if you write with the water of lead, meaning you put the lead in water, the water got dark, you write with that, that's not considered to be permanent writing. And so someone could basically write non-permanent writing, and then the witness writes on top of that permanent writing, and that counts as the witness writing himself. Rabbi Avoh said you would use mein melin, that you would do, if a witness did not know how to write, you would first write his name for him in mein melin. Melin, I don't know how they translate as gall water is what I read. I don't know what galls are, but I guess some kind of nut. So anyways, it's not
nut juice.
But it's not permanent, so it doesn't count as writing itself. Ask the Gemara, wait, where am I? Yes, but it says, where is that true? That it's not permanent. Vatani Rabbi Chia, ktavo b'mei tarya v'aftza, aftza are gallnuts, right? It's kasher. That if you write with mei tarya, you may write it with aftza, it would be kosher. So again, that means it's permanent writing. Says the Gemara, lokasha, again, there's a difference between had afitz, had lo afitz. It depends on whether afitz means that it's the literally means it's difficult, right? That meaning it depends on whether it was hard and it was processed, and whether the nuts basically were a permanent dye or they weren't a permanent dye. She'ein mei milin agabi mei milin, because you can basically it talks about where afitz means where you where the parchment itself was soaked. When we talked about this last week, and we're gonna have it again today. We had this Gemara last week, that when you soak remember there was a problem about erasing, right? If you erase a letter in the star, will you be able to see that it was erased? So if you soak the star in this mei afitz, then it gets dark basically, and then you can tell when you erase something. But what what the Gemara is saying is that you can't do mei meilin al gabi mei meilin. So if the document itself, the parchment, was soaked in mei meilin, then you can't write on top of it in the mei meilin, and then you wouldn't be able to do this for someone who is illiterate or unable to write.
They soaked it after the writing to make it permanent, or they soaked it before the writing?
Before the writing. They soaked it before the writing, so that when you would write on top of it and then you erased it, it would be noticeable that you had erased it. Rav Papa Amar, now obviously it wasn't black, otherwise you can't write on it, right? So it was just darkened, but you could still write on top of it. But you can't do the same ink basically on top of that ink. So you'd have to use some other type of darker ink. Rav Papa Amar Baruch. Papa said, you know what you could do is you can use saliva, and saliva will fade out, of course, so it's not permanent, and you could use that to trace it. They'll see, I guess, the liquid even, or, you don't even need a color. You can see that there's some moisture there, and then they could write on top of that. V'chein orile Rav Papa the Papa Torah. Rav Papa, told Papa Torah. Papa Torah is a shar, right? A animal, cow. So Papa was an ox, shar. What's it called? A cow herder. He didn't know how to write his name, but he had to sign on a get. I guess there was no one else there. So he told him, Birok, you should do it with roke, use it with spit, and then you could type, you could trace your name. However, says the Gemara, Gittin, all of this is only true by a get, because we said that by Gittin, we had a little bit of a kula here, because we're afraid that if you don't find a person to do it, you're not going to be able to get divorced. You won't do it properly. But generally, when you have a star, you're not allowed to rely on this, and you should wait till you can find a witness who knows how to sign their own name. Because there was once a person who did this by a star. They couldn't find someone to sign. They found some illiterate person and said, let me just give you, I'll trace it out for you and you sign. The Nagdir Rav Kahana said he should be put in cherem, or he should be punished, because you're not allowed to do that when you're talking about a regular star. You're only allowed to do it. You have to wait till you find a witness who's an expert. You can only rely on this when you get to a get. And again, it's because we want to help the woman with the get, so she doesn't have to wait until there's proper witnesses.
Well, the time is more of the essence.
Correct, by a get, correct. Tanya Kavatei de Rav, and turn to the daf on Yotet Amabet. There's a bright, in fact, that supports Rav, that says, Eidim Shein Yodim Lachtom. If you have witnesses who don't know how to sign, Mikarin Lahem Niyar Chalak, you should tear out their names basically in a blank piece of paper, and then they will fill up the parts with ink. Again, it's not, as I said, the issue of stenciling is a little bit problematic, but it doesn't necessarily mean they make a stencil, because they could sign their name within but you could, like, say, make a dalid, and they could then write their name within the dalid without filling up the whole space, right? That just gives them an outline of where to write. So it's not necessarily going to be a problem that everyone's signature is going to look the same. But anyways, that's something you can rely on, which is what Rav said. Amar Reb Shimon ben Gamliel said, Medvar Memurim, when is that true that you can rely on this heter to use an illiterate witness who then gets, help writing their name? That's only b'gitei nashim. That's only by women's, by a get. Aval b'shichrei avadim, b'shar kol shtarot, by sort of gittin or shichrei avadim, that free slaves, or all other shtarot that, essentially are about documents, about loaning money, regular purchases. Im yodim likrot v'lachtom chotmim. If the witnesses know how to read and they know how to sign, they can sign. V'im lav ein chotmim, but otherwise you can't sign. Says the Gemara, well, that's interesting, but you just added a whole new element, which we haven't discussed till now, which is reading, right? Because till now it made it sound like as long as the Eidim could sign their names, that even if they were illiterate, but they knew how to sign their name, which there must be more terms for that, right? Someone who can sign their name but can't necessarily read, but that would be implied previously, that would be okay. And here Reb Shimon Gamliel says the Eidim need to know how to read and sign. So ask the Gemara, Kriya, Mandachar Shmei, who's mentioned reading? We haven't had that, hasn't come up at all so far. So that's the Gemara, you're right. Chasuri Mechasu, you have to add a little words, right? Something's missing in the Braita, the Hachi Ketani. This is the way the whole Braita should read. Says the Tanakama, Edim Shen Yodim Likrot, witnesses who don't know how to read. So we didn't mention that before, but now we're adding sort of this part to the Braita. If a witness does not know how to read, then Korin Lifnehem, you read the get or the document, the shtar to them, and then Chotmin. And then they sign on what you read to them. Now, they don't know if what you read is accurate, right? But they are signing that this is what was read to us, and this is, we're okay with this. But if Ein, now continue reading, if Ein Yodim Lachtom, and if they don't even know how to sign, then presumably you would read it to them, and then you would trace out for them so they could sign. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel takes exception to both parts. Rabbi Shimon, but in general, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel medvar memurim, that you rely on witnesses who can't read and who can't write their names even. That's Gittin nashim. But in all other circumstances, im yodin likrot v'lachtom chotmin. If the witnesses know how to read the shtar and they know how to sign their names, then they can be reliable witnesses. The imlav ein chotmin. But I disagree, and I say that they cannot sign by other documents if they are not able to read and to write. And the Tanakama did not make that distinction. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel seems to disagree with the Tanakama. Amar Rabbi Elazar, my time at Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Why did Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel say that this is permitted only by Gittin nashim? Meaning, why did he make an exception? Because Tanakama seems to hold that the witnesses never need to know how to read or write. You can read to them, and then you can help them sign. But Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that's not okay. But it's okay in Gittin nashim. So why did he make an exception by Gittin nashim? So the Gemara, as we said, Shlo Yehu Benot Yisrael Agunot, so that it wouldn't leave Benot Yisrael, without being able to remarry. So their husbands left them or no longer interested in them, right? The man in that circumstance can always go and remarry if he has enough money, right? Or if he goes away, or Rashi says that, obviously, remember, we've talked about this a lot, that they very often wrote Gittin when they were going on dangerous journeys. They're going to the military, right? They're going to war. They're going on a ship, as we talked about last week. So people would write Gittin because, unfortunately, they might never come back, or they might be unheard of, right? So, but if you don't allow them to do it, unless there's witnesses and it's urgent and they're being called up for the draft, you have no one there who's literate, then you would end up with Benot Yisrael Agunot. So therefore, they were mekel in that specific circumstance. Amar Rava, in fact, Halacha Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, that's the way it is, that you can be mekel by Gittin nashim, but in general, you have to have witnesses who can read and write to be part of a shtar. The Rav Gamda Mishmei de Rava Amar, but Rav Gamda in the name of Rava, so not Rava himself. So again, I guess he's reporting differently from what Rava told him. Ein halacha. This is not the halacha like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. This is where El Kaman, so it must be Kirabanan, right? It must be like the Rabbanan. Now it seems to be obvious. We're going to ask from a story. Right? It must be like the Rabbanan that every get, every shtar, including shtar of mammon, is kosher from a witness, even if the witness can't read and write, as long as you help them get their name there. Ask Gemara if that's true, that's how Rava paskins. Bahahu David Uvda B'Shar Shtarot, as we quoted earlier on Daf Amud Aleph. There was an incident, a famous incident, where someone relied on this kula by a different shtar, and they wrote a shtar for sale of their house, let's say, and they relied on witnesses who couldn't read and write, and they helped them out. The Nagdi Rav Kahana, and Rav Kahana said, punish that person. That's not the right thing to do. So how could you explain that? So that's, well, you're right, but with Tirgamot, you have to understand, you have to explain that when Rav Gamda said in the name of Rava, the halachas, like Chachamim, he meant akri'ah. He's referring, he actually split it, right? The Chachamim seem to say that the witnesses don't need to read the get or sign the get, or know how to sign. They need help to sign. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel said they need to do both. When Rav said we pass like the Chachamim, he meant for one of them, for reading. So that according to Rava, according to the Rav Gamda, in the name of Rava, the witnesses on any shtar do not need to read the shtar. You can read the shtar to them. They have to be able to sign their own name. But if they can't sign their own name, then you're not allowed to rely on this except for a Gittin nashim. And that's where Rav Kahana got angry at someone who relied on it, even for regular shtarot.
The Shichrei Avadim, it switches there.
You mean why right? So this implies
in the original Braita, it didn't count, but then when he reread it, it does. You can do it.
So there's two opinions, right? So in the original Braita, the Tanakama said you can, sorry. And Rav Shimon ben Elazar said, Shimon Gamliel, sorry, said you can. The opposite. Tanakama says you can. Shimon Gamliel said you cannot. But the only exception, according to this, and this is where we end, is Gittin Nashim. So Shechrei Avadim, even though they're very frequently compared to Gittin Nashim, would not be an exception.
A middle case, like there's more likely to be lenient in that case than a star of.
So that's not how we're coming out. We're coming out that there's three cases, like you said.
Everybody says for land, you well, that's not true.
Not the Chachamim, but according to Rava, that's how we pass, like that middle case, that for land and for Shechrei Avadim, you would have to have witnesses who could read it. You can't read it. I'm sorry, you don't have to have witnesses who can read it. You have to have witnesses who can sign independently. And even though the brightest seem to say that you don't need that, Rava said we paskin that you do need that, except for Gittin Nashim, which are the exception.
Yeah, but you would think that public policy would also, like, if you can free your slave, there would be it's not like a get, but in the public.
Yeah. I mean, you certainly can see that. Yeah, I think
more than like sale of land, which you could wait a while to get your adim.
Correct, potentially, yeah. Okay, so that's where we got up to. That's the halacha. There, and again, we've quoted some of this before. Now, Rav Yehuda was not his eyesight was going, so he really was not able to see. Okay, and Rav Yehuda would be mitzta'er karei. He could read with a lot of effort the chatem, and he was able to sign. Right. So, meaning if you gave Rav Yehuda a document to sign, I don't know again why you had to give it to him. He was an old man who couldn't see, had very bad cataracts. He would sort of squint and struggle and put a lot of effort into reading the document. So Amalei Ula, so Ula said to Rav Yehuda, "Why are you putting in so much effort? Lo tzrichat. You don't need to work on reading it." Rabbi Elazar, think about it. We know that Rabbi Elazar, who was Mara de Eretz Yisrael, was his title, right? He was the Mar, he was the king of Eretz Yisrael, meaning he was the leading rabbinic authority in Eretz Yisrael. And he, Karu Kameh v'chatem, they would read it to him and he would sign, right? So and the same thing was happening with Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman, Karu Kameh Safrei Dayani v'chatem. And the Rav Nachman would also have the Safrei Dayani, which really means the official royal scribes, right? The Dayanim scribes. They would get the documents. He wouldn't take the effort, maybe because he was hard of vision, it was dark. He wouldn't read all the text. Someone would read it to him. He would listen, and if it made sense to him, he would sign on the bottom that he read, that he agreed with it. So why do you have to read it? Now points out the Gemara, but this is only Dafka Rav Nachman v'Safrei Dayani. This is you can only rely on this trick of having people read to you if you're Rav Nachman, meaning they're terrified of you, and that if they trick you, if they read incorrectly and you see that someone misled you, Rav Nachman was very powerful, you're gonna fire them or worse, right? And the Safrei Dayani, who were the official scribes, right? That was their job, was to do reading in the court. They were the court scribes. The Itlei Imta. They have fear of Rav Nachman that Rav Nachman was the Dayan in Bavel, and that they would get fired or they'd be punished. Aval Rav Nachman v'Safrei Achrini, but if you have Rav Nachman and other scribes who don't work for him in the court, so they're not as kafuf to him, or Safrei Dayani v'Inish Achrini, or even if you have the court scribes, but it's some random person who they're not as beholden to, right? Another judge. In those cases, you would not be able to rely on them because you can't trust that they're going to put in perfect accuracy and read it exactly perfectly. And so that's the challenge, right? Is you have to, you can rely on people to read it to you if you're confident that they're so careful in reading it that they're not going to read it wrong. And then you could trust them. Rav Papa, I'm going to tell all these stories. Rav Papa, kiaviati the kameh shtar parsa'a, right? Rav Papa, when they brought in front of him a document that was written in Persian, Papa, of course, was in Bavel, right? And so they would bring documents that were done, the Avid Barkaot Shel Goyim, they were done, as we had earlier, the Arkaot, right, the non-Jewish official courts, and they were written in Persian. And I presume he didn't know how to read Persian, right?
We're not talking about a get here.
We're not talking about a get. We're talking about a regular star, right?
The get has to be in Hebrew, right?
A get.
Didn't we learn that? Or am I wrong?
I don't recall. I don't think so.
A get can be in any language.
Yeah, I thought so. Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks for that. I wasn't confident of the answer. I didn't want to say the wrong thing, but I don't think.
So it could be
But
we're talking about a get here then.
yeah, but here, but right, we'll see the story, but it seems to be talking, and we'll see why about regular shtarot. So when Rav Papa was a judge, he was sitting in a court. They would bring in front of him, a shtar parsa, which said maybe in some foreign language that Ruvain owes Shimon $100, but makri l'shnei goyim zeh shelo b'fnei zeh. He would basically have two non-Jews who didn't matter they were non-Jews. It mattered that they read Persian, right? Two native Persian speakers. He would have them read it in front of him and translate it in front of him, basically, right? With two different people, each one not in front of the other, so that they didn't actually know, they would then sort of say what the other one said. He wanted independent confirmation. And it would be Mesiach Lefi Tumo. He would make it to them that it was meaning Mesiach Lefi Tumo means just chatting, right? He didn't say to them, this is an official document. We want you to tell me what it said. He'd basically hand it to someone and say, can you tell me what this says, right? And not as part of court, basically. And they would say, oh, it says Reuven owes Shimon $100, let's say. Reuven borrowed $100 from Shimon on the third day of, Adar. So if they both read it and they confirmed that it both said the same thing, then, and he could trust them, not because he was not asking them for testimony, he was sort of getting them to just report, and then he would rely on it. And furthermore, Magbi Beimin Mishabde, he would collect from it from even Mishubadim, like a regular shtar. So that from the time that Ruvain borrowed this $100 from Shimon, everything that Ruvain sold would be Mishubad to this shtar, to this money. Amar Rav Ashi, Amar Lihuna Bar Natan. Now Rav Ashi said, I heard from Huna Bar Natan, Hachi Amar Amemar, that he said in the name of Amemar. Again, these were all very prominent Amoraim who were judges in Bavel. Hai Shtara Parsa'a, Dechatima Lesada Yisrael, Magben Lebi Mishabdi. We had this last week, if you recall, right? This if you find a shtar that's a Persian shtar, meaning it's written in Persian, but the witnesses are trustworthy Israelim, you can be Magbinam Bein Mishabdi, you can collect from it like any other shtar, even from property that was sold after the time, to someone else after the time of the date of the shtar. We asked last week when we read the same Gemara, how can you say that these people are witnesses? They don't know how to read the language. No, the Yadi, it must be that they know how to read Persian. So you're talking specifically about Jews who are fluent in that language. That's more, but what about the fact that they didn't, remember we talked about last week, they didn't write shtarot in Persian in I guess Bavel that were very good paper. So it was easy to counterfeit them. You need a writing on a piece of paper or a piece of parchment that can't easily be erased. Remember that you would write it in a way that you can erase it and change it. The leka, you don't have that. No, it's where they did that. But the afitzin, they put the document, the shtar into this gallnut juice, which darkened it, so that if you then erase the letter, people would see that you erased it. Remember, we said that one of the requirements of a shtar is that you need to repeat like the essential information in the last line, the leka, and they didn't used to do that in those shtarot. Says, well, no, they did it. The Mahadir, they in fact wrote it the way we would normally write a shtar in Jewish, a Hebrew shtar. Says, well, if they did everything right, right? What's the chiddush? Tichol lashon kasher. Thank you. I knew we were getting there. Is that the chiddush? That exactly the question that Hanan asked, that you can write a shtar, including a get, in any language, meaning even in Persian. Tanina, that's a Mishnah later on in this Masechta we're going to get to in a couple months, where it says, get shekatvo ivrit, the edav yivani, the get that's written in Hebrew and the witness is signed in Greek, or the get is written in Greek, yivanit, ve'edav ivrit, is kasher. So you see that you don't need to write a get specifically in Hebrew. So again, what was the big chiddush? That this get that's written in Persian and has regular Jewish signers is kosher. It's smart because the chiddush here was not just a get. If you had only had the Mishnah Gittin later on, that you can write a get in Yavanit, havamina hani mili begittin. I would say that's only true about a get, which we've already seen today. There are certain kulot by a get because we want a woman to be able to get married if her husband needs to write a get. Avo b'shar shtarot lo, but you might think it's not true by other shtarot where there is a slightly higher bar, because you can wait, like the signature. Kamashman, that it's okay that every star can be written in any language as long as the people know how to read it or understand it. Amar Shmuel. Now, Shmuel says an interesting halacha, which we're going to sort of do in some detail now. Where are we? You got it, everyone, right? So it's like 2/3 of the way down. Says Shmuel, an interesting halacha, if natan la niyar chalak, if a person gives his wife a blank piece of paper, and he says to her, Amar la harezegitech, this is your get. Says Shmuel migoreshet, she's divorced. Well, she's not really divorced. It means that we have to assume she's divorced. Why? It's a blank piece of paper. Because chayshinan shema b'mei melon katfo. We have to worry that maybe he wrote it with invisible ink, essentially. Right? Invisible ink is not really invisible ink. It's ink that was visible at the time you wrote it, but got absorbed into the parchment, and now you can't read it anymore. But at the time he wrote it, it said, Ruvain, what has been so-and-so, divorces her. And even though it's blank right now, it essentially was a get in the beginning. Don't worry, we'll get into all the details.
Even the ADIM, the signature and invisible.
I guess so. Same. Everyone used the same ink. Mates, they ask him what want to get it. There's a brayta that says the following: a man says to a woman, "Hareze gitech, here's your get," and she's horrified. She says, "What do you? I don't want this get." Well, she took it. The talto, she takes it from him. Uzraktoli yam. She throws it into the sea. So no one ever saw the get. And he handed her a piece of paper and said, "Here's your get," and she threw it off the side of the boat into the water. Ola or she threw it into the fire. Ocha davar ha'aved, or any place where it got destroyed. The chazar va'amar, and then the husband says, "Just kidding." Right? It wasn't really a get. Shtar pasimhu. Now, pasim literally means fayes, right? To appease someone. So he said it was a document that I wanted to give to you that would make people think that you have a lot of money, right? That's how shtar pasim usually means, that you basically says, Ruvain owes Shimon $10,000, so everyone thinks Shimon has a lot of money. Or shtar amanahu, it's a shtar of amanav of trust, which is similar, where you basically gave a document and said, "I'll pay you $1 million," even though you wouldn't really, but you want that person, I think Donald Trump did this a lot. You want that other person to think that you have a lot of money, right? So they're basically fake shtarot. You never really meant them. So in any of those cases, the Braita says migoreshet, right? She's divorced. V'lo kol himenu lo osra, because you don't allow him just to say it's not a real get, right? The husband handed his wife a get. Everyone saw that it was written on it. She threw it away. No one ever read it. But we don't trust that, if a man hands his wife a get and says it's a get, we assume it's a get, even though we haven't read it, right? Now, says the Gemara, that's a bright time. There, at least something is written on it. All the husband is claiming is that I wrote things that were, not a get. They were some other writing. But the implication from there is haleka ktav. If it's blank, it wouldn't count at all, right? If a husband handed his wife a blank document, she threw it into the ocean. He says, "Oh, it was your get." We don't trust him, and we don't say she's divorced. Lo, says Gemara. Well, one second. Ki kamar Shmuel. When Shmuel said that, in fact, this is a kosher get, it's debatkina la b'maya dinara. It's where you check it with the water of Nara. Nara, Rashi understands it means that it's like a colored kind of thing, which basically eat palate, right? If the plate means to come out, right? So if the writing will come out, it'll basically reawaken the invisible ink. It's not invisible, but the ink that was absorbed, it comes up and you can see the traces of it. But so that's where Shmuel said you believe it, because if something comes up, then it counts. Ilo palate lav klamu. But if nothing comes up, then it doesn't count, and she's not divorced. Says the Gemara, 1 second. Chi palate my havi. Right? Let's say you put this water on top of it, and the writing underneath it comes up, and it now says, Ruvain divorces his wife Leah. So what? It doesn't mean that she's divorced, because hashtahu de palate, right? Why would she be divorced from the time that Ruvain gave the get to his wife? At that time, there was no writing. You're basically making the writing now. So the writing didn't exist at the time that it was handed over, right? So there was no get. It was basically a get that came after the fact. You've got to start the whole process over. You could take it back now, Ruvain, and hand it back to her and give it to her, but it shouldn't count. Says, Mer, you're right. Shmuel nami chashinan kamer. All Shmuel said was that you worry about it, meaning it's not clear what happened, because, and again, so the question is, what is even the concern? But the possibility is that maybe at the time he handed it to her, Rashi says here, the ink was still visible, right? And then later, when we looked at it an hour later or 2 days later, it was invisible. You put ink on top of it and you see actually that that there were letters written there. But that's the doubt. The doubt is, were they there at the time he handed it to her? Were they not there? The fact is that when we checked whatever days after he handed it to her, we didn't see it anymore. And so the whole thing remains in some uncertainty. The bottom line here is you shouldn't write a get this way, right? It's not terribly advisable. You're going to make more problems. Amar Ravina, now let's do a few more cases. Amar Ravina, Amar Amemar, Amemar said to me, Hachi Amar Meremar Mishmei Rav Dimi, excuse me, Hani Beitrei, the Yav Gita Kamayo. If they hand over a get in front of two witnesses, Tzricha Lemikraya, they have to read the get in front of those witnesses, meaning it's not enough for the witnesses just to say, we saw the husband or the husband's messenger hand over a get to the woman or the woman's messenger. At the time that they see it being handed over, they have to have it read in front of them so they know what's being handed over. Meitfei, now they ask, what about from this case we just said? If a person says to a woman, Hareze Gitech, here's your get. She takes it and she throws it into the sea, or to a fire, right? Anywhere where it's destroyed. The Chazar Vamar, and then the husband says, just joking, it wasn't really a get. Shtar pasimhu, shtar amanahu. In either case, says the bride, migoreshet, right? The local himeno lo osra. You don't allow him just to say she's asr, meaning she's not divorced. I don't get it. If they have to read it, so what's the question? If he handed it to her and someone read it and said, this is a shtar, and then she threw it into the ocean, and he said, oh, it wasn't really a get, why would you trust him, right? If you have to always read it when you hand it over, then I don't get it. After it was read and it said, Reuven divorces Leah, how could he then say, oh, I was joking? It didn't say that. It said, I owe you $1 million, right? Says somewhere, because here the case is, he's a magician. The butter dekario, right? After the witnesses read it, the husband took it back to hand to her. Right, Ayla lebeyade, he took it back in his own hands, the afghan, and then he handed it to her. Of course, everyone might think he did the bait and switch. He gave the shtar, the get to which every magician does, right? He gave the get to the witnesses, said, read this. They handed it back to him. He switched it with, a blank piece of paper. So he's just playing games with her, right? So afke, he switched it. I'm sorry, afke means he gave it to her. You might think he switched it up. That's a really far-fetched case, and that we don't say that. Now, of course, if she had it in her hand, she could open it up and read it, right? But she threw it away. And so because of that, we do not assume that, in fact, he did that. Now, hu gavra, dezark lagita l'debitu l'beini dani. There was a person who threw a get to his wife, right? L'debitu is to his wife, and it landed. It was in her space. Remember, as soon as it gets into her space, she's kona. She doesn't need to actually hold it as long as it's her own personal chutzner, right? The space of a person is a kinyan. So he throws her a get, it lands in her property, and she's divorced. But he threw it behind. Beidani means behind the barrels, right? He threw it behind the storage. So she went back there to find it, or someone went back there to find it, and they reach in and they pick out a piece of parchment and they pick it up, and it turns out it's not a get, it's a mezuzah. Ishtakich mezusta, right? They find that there's a mezuzah there. So what do you assume? Do you assume that that's something different, that there was a mezuzah that happened to be sitting there because someone dropped one? Says Rav Nachman, that's very unlikely. Rav Nachman, mezusta beini dani lo shchicha. You don't usually find a mezuzah behind the barrels. And so therefore, you have to assume that he didn't throw her a get. He threw her this mezuzah, and it looks like a get. It's rolled up, and he's playing games with her, saying, here's your get. He's not really giving her get. And since she never saw the get, she's not divorced. The hani mili shtakechada. Now, that's only true if you find one piece of parchment and it's a mezuzah. But if you find a bunch of mezuzahs, avashnayim shlosha, then midahahavi hanamahavi, right? He threw one thing. So if you threw one thing and you go back there and there's a whole bunch of parchments, right? No one's been there. It's like behind the fridge, right? No one's been there for 3 years. And you get behind them, you find all these little small pieces of paper, and all of them are mezuzahs. So you don't find the get. But still, the fact is that since there's 2 other mezuzahs there, this third one that you found was probably there from before, and what he threw was presumed to be the get. Now, why didn't you find it? The Gita, where's the get? Emar achbarim shiklu. Right, the weasels, or however much achbar, the mice, usually took it. So the fact that you don't find it, like it's like chametz, right? The fact that you don't find it is not a proof that it wasn't there. The question is, you found something else. But if you found many something else's, and he only threw one, you have to assume that in fact he did throw a get, and that what you found was a mezuzah that was there unrelated to this. Now, on the same topic of throwing a mezuzah, Ahu Gavra to Ola Beit Knishta, there was once a person who walked into shul, right? Shakal Sefer Torah. He went into the Aron, he took out the Sefer Torah, Yavle the Debitu, and he handed it to his wife. I guess they were very progressive. They handed the Sefer Torah to the women then. And Amar La Hagitich, and he said, here's your get.
Huh.
So, Rav Yosef, I don't get it. He said, Rav Yosef, what exactly are you worried about, right? Are you worried that in the middle of the night, he went into the shul, he opened the Sefer Torah, and on the side of the Sefer Torah, in like invisible ink, right, he wrote a get, that Ruvain divorces, Leah. You're worried that he wrote basically in this, water that is invisible. Remember, because you would soak the parchment of the Torah in Mei Melon, you can't write on top of it in that way. Ein Mei Melon, al gabi Mei Melon. So that anything he would write on top of it would not matter. Imishum kritut. Now, what are you worried that maybe she's divorced, not because he wrote on it, Ruvain divorces Leah. It's because the Torah uses the words kritut, right? The Torah says, v'chatav la sefer kritut. So maybe he said, I'm relying on what Moshe wrote in the Torah.
Oh, but it's weird.
If he's relying on the fact that it says the words in the Torah, that's ridiculous. Right? You need to write a get for her. You don't write the Sefer Torah for her. So the fact that you can't say, I'm relying on the words of the Torah of Katav La Sefer Kritut, and I'm handing it to you, right? You can't do that. Says more, well, maybe, maybe when the Sofer is writing the Torah, he says, can you do me a favor? Here's $50. Write the words, V'natan La Sefer Kritut, in mind for my wife. I want to divorce my wife at some future time. But still, first of all, it's very far-fetched. But more importantly, it doesn't, you have to write the names, right? You need to write the names, the cities, his name. You can't just write V'natan La Sefer Kritut. So it's not a chiddush. Says the Gemara, so Rav Yosef, my kamashwan. So what was Rav Yosef teaching us, right? That if you hand the Sefer Torah to your wife and say you're divorced, it doesn't count. He must be teaching us she'ein mei milon al gabi mei milon. He must be teaching us that principle. That in fact, because you can't write on a Sefer Torah with mei melon, because since the Sefer Torah is processed in mei melon, additional writing on it doesn't count as permanent writing. And so even if the husband wrote in mei melon in the scroll in the side of a Sefer Torah that I divorced my wife and then handed it to her, that does not count as writing, and therefore she's not divorced. So a very far-fetched case, but I think we're going to stop there. And we tomorrow, Rav Chisda is like 5 lines down, right? So can pick that up from there. I'm not exactly sure who's doing the daf tomorrow.
So it starts out progressive because he gave her the Sefer Torah.
Yeah, but then he tried to divorce her.
Switches that doesn't stay that way very long.
Yeah, I don't think they would call it progressive. Yes. Anyways, we're 6 lines from the top. I'm going to put it in the chat. I don't know if David is doing it tomorrow. I don't know the answer. I was really hoping to, but I unfortunately cannot. I have to be.
Tomorrow's Monday. You never do Monday.
No, but Dove is away for a while.
Dove is away from next week.
And I usually work on Monday. I'm not working tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm gonna pick up Mondays from the week after that.
Got it. So I'm in Chicago still, but unfortunately, I have to be at this meeting hall at 6:30. So it doesn't give me any time really.
Okay.
So we'll figure it out. Thank you both for joining. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.
Yeah,